We're starting this deep dive right in the middle of something pretty intense. NATO has just given the green light, potentially, for Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine. And, well, the Kremlin didn't wait long to react.
No, not at all. It was dramatic, you could say.
Right.
Russian officials, Dmitry Peskov included, they immediately called it a dramatic moment. They're framing it as a sharp escalation in tensions. This isn't just, another news headline. It's really a live-action case study in escalation management.
Right. And that's our mission today, isn't it? To kind of unpack the strategy behind this decision. We want to step back from the breaking news alerts and use our sources. We've got contemporary reports from this month, October 2025, but also some classic strategic studies to look at this with a lens of, well, Cold War deterrence theory and also modern signaling.
Yeah, and I think the first thing you really need to grasp is the foundational context here. Russia's invasion back in 2022, it wasn't just about breaking rules. It fundamentally ended the post-Cold War security setup in Europe. By using force like that to grab territory, Russia immediately created these huge risks of escalation. Two kinds, really. Horizontal, meaning the fight spreading beyond Ukraine, and vertical, which is the nuclear risk.
And looking at the research, it seems like navigating this kind of crisis, stopping that acute escalation, it depends on this really dynamic mix. You need both threats and restraint at the same time.
Absolutely. And that's where, the old Cold War thinkers suddenly feel very relevant again. You think of Thomas Schelling straight away, his idea of the threat that leaves something to chance. Deterrence, for Schelling, it wasn't about drawing bright red lines. It was about manipulating uncertainty. Brinkmanship, he called it. You make your opponent worry that their next action could trigger some kind of unplanned spiral, something neither side wants or can fully control. That fear, that uncertainty, that's your leverage.
But that sounds incredibly risky. If you're playing with uncertainty, how do you stop things from just completely spinning out of control?
Well, that's where someone like Alexander George comes into the picture. His work really stressed the need for these informal, sort of unspoken understandings, a basic rule of prudence, he called it. And the big one, the rule that's basically held since 2022, is that the nuclear powers have to avoid a direct clash between their own uniformed military forces. That one specific restraint, avoiding that direct NATO-Russia fight, that's been the absolute bedrock. It's held things together, relatively speaking.
Yeah, but that bedrock feels like it's under constant pressure, especially with Russia's main strategy here, which seems to be nuclear coercion. We've just seen this relentless drumbeat, right? These nuclear threats coming out of Moscow, seemingly designed just to intimidate the West.
Oh, definitely. The frequency, the directness of it all. People are comparing it to Khrushchev, more than 60 years back. You just have to remember Putin's initial threat right at the start of the full-scale invasion, warning anyone who tries to stand in our way. He said Russia's response would bring consequences you have never seen in your entire history. That's pretty direct.
It's pure intimidation, yeah. But it feels like it's backed up by a kind of strategic ambiguity, too.
Exactly. Russia deliberately keeps its nuclear doctrine fuzzy. They hint, for example, that a nuclear response might be okay even if Russia suffers a conventional attack from a non-nuclear country, if that country is being supported by a nuclear power. That vagueness is aimed right at the West. They want Western capitals constantly worrying, second-guessing whether sending this weapon system or that one finally crosses some invisible nuclear line.
And the Tomahawk missile seems tailor-made for that Russian narrative now.
What?
We saw former President Medvedev really zeroing in on this specific weapon just recently, in October 2025. He even addressed President Trump personally in his warnings.
Yes, and Medvedev's core argument plays perfectly into that Schelling idea of uncertainty. He warned quite explicitly that once a Tomahawk is launched, it is basically impossible to distinguish if it's carrying a conventional warhead or a nuclear one. By highlighting that specific point, he's forcing NATO planners to confront the risk that Russia might misinterpret a conventional strike as a strategic nuclear attack, and that potentially triggers vertical escalation. You also had the Belarusian leader Lukashenko echoing this, saying Tomahawks would lead to nuclear war.
So are these the infamous red lines we hear so much about? Is the Tomahawk crossing a real red line?
Well, the analysis suggests probably not, at least not in the way we usually think of red lines as clear fixed boundaries.
Yeah.
Russia's red lines seem intentionally soft. They're variable, they're contingent on the situation. Their main purpose seems psychological. It's about intimidation, about making Western states hesitate. Remember, Putin himself said, "We ourselves will determine in each specific case where it will be drawn." That lack of clarity is what gives them leverage.
Okay, so Russia draws these fuzzy lines to create fear, and the West's response seems to be adopting that other shelling concept, the idea of gently eroding a boundary.
Mhm.
This is the whole salami slicing strategy for military aid.
That's exactly it. It's an incremental approach. Instead of one big dramatic move that practically guarantees a massive Russian reaction, the West slowly, piece by piece, upgrades the type of military aid going to Ukraine. You sort of ease across what Moscow called a red line, but you do it in a way that doesn't create an immediate, huge new challenge. You test the limits carefully.
And we've seen this playbook run again and again, haven't we? First, it was the Javelin anti-tank missiles. They were supposedly a red line. Then HIMARS rocket systems, then Patriot air defense, then F-16 jets. None of them actually led to that massive military escalation Russia threatened against NATO countries themselves.
Right. Because the risk calculation inside, say, the U.S. government seems to be this continuous cycle. It's like, okay, we did X, there was no major escalation, no direct military strike on NATO territory. So can we maybe do Y next? It's this dynamic process trying to figure out how much political noise Russia will make versus how much actual military risk they're willing to run before they genuinely change their posture towards NATO itself.
Which brings us squarely back to the Tomahawk. Let's set aside the specific launcher for a moment. What capability does this weapon give Ukraine that they just didn't have before?
Well, the big things are deep strike range and serious payload power. The Tomahawk Land Attack Missile, or TLM, it's a long-range, very precise weapon. Its operational range is well over 1,600 kilometers, maybe up to 2,500, depending on the variant. Though realistically, the version Ukraine gets is probably limited, maybe around 1,700 kilometers.
Yeah.
But even that range, that alone is transformative. It puts the entire depth of European Russia, places previously considered untouchable sanctuaries, potentially within reach.
And how does that stack up against what Ukraine has now, like their long-range drones?
The tactical difference is mainly in the punchy packs, the payload. Tomahawks carry much, much larger warheads. We're talking hundreds of kilograms of high explosives, not just, a few dozen kilos like many drones. So you combine that precision guidance with that kind of destructive power. Well, experts say it creates a real headache for Russia. Because now, Russia has to think about spreading its limited advanced air defense systems over a much, much wider area to protect really key strategic sites.
So potential targets could be things deep inside Russia, like critical oil and gas facilities, air bases they use to launch missiles at Ukraine, even symbolically, places like Moscow or St. Petersburg.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of targets that become theoretically vulnerable. And look, while Tomahawks are normally launched from ships or big bombers, things Ukraine doesn't have, the U.S. seems to have sorted that. There's this new ground-based launcher, the XMAV from Oshkosh Defense. They've demonstrated it. It looks like a mobile truck configuration. That solves the platform problem.
Okay, but then how do you square taking this escalation risk if, as some reports suggest, the number of missiles might actually be quite small initially? Is it really a game changer on the battlefield straight away?
That seems to be the crucial constraint, yes. Despite the weapons capability, the reporting suggests the initial quantity might be quite limited, maybe only 20 to 50 missiles. And while the Pentagon has, thousands of these in its total inventory, getting new ones built is slow. So experts are pretty clear. That kind of small number is insufficient to ensure sustained deep strikes against Russia. It's a significant political and psychological blow, yes, but maybe not a sustained military campaign winner, at least not initially.
So if the immediate military impact might be limited by numbers, then the real play here is political signaling. How does it look like President Trump is using this?
He seems to be adopting a very calculated pause. He said something like he's sort of made a decision, but crucially wants to talk to Putin first. It looks very much like he's using the approval of Tomahawks as a massive bargaining chip. It's a demonstration of resolve, something he can offer to hold back on or fully implement, depending on whether Moscow gets serious about talks, or as he puts it, serious about finding a way to end the war.
And he has used some pretty unconventional signaling before, particularly around nuclear issues, hasn't he?
Yeah, that was fascinating earlier this year, his response to Medvedev's intensified nuclear rhetoric. Trump claimed publicly that he'd moved 2 U.S. nuclear submarines closer to Russia. He even said, when he mentioned the word nuclear, my eyes light up. Now, whether he actually did that or it was purely symbolic signaling, who knows? But it's definitely highly unusual, almost mirroring that Schelling-esque manipulation of risk.
And meanwhile, how are NATO allies reacting to this latest round of Russian threats over Tomahawks? Are they genuinely worried about, say, a direct military strike on a NATO country?
The official line from NATO seems to be unfazed. They fully expect more strong words from Moscow, more disinformation, more of what they call irresponsible rhetoric, including the nuclear threats. But the assessment seems to be that they don't actually anticipate direct military action against NATO members as a result of this. The thinking appears to be that Russia has already kind of factored in and adapted strategically to the previous incremental steps in weapons deliveries.
And President Zelensky in Ukraine, he seems to be using this moment to project strength back towards Moscow.
He's definitely leveraging it to try and shift the perception, the strategic narrative. Zelensky said the Tomahawk delivery might force Russia to see the real state of affairs. He even had that line about Kremlin officials needing to know where the bomb shelters are.
Yeah.
But importantly, he also publicly stressed likely reflecting conditions from suppliers that Ukraine would only use them against military targets, not civilians. Adhering to those constraints is key.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. We've got the Cold War theories from Schelling and George, these salami slicing tactics, the specific Tomahawk issue. What's the kind of final take on strategic deterrence in this conflict as it stands now?
Well, I think it really confirms that classic nuclear deterrence theory is still incredibly relevant, maybe more than ever. The whole balance seems to rely on keeping that mix going. Schelling's threat that leaves something to chance combined with George's idea of pragmatic, ad hoc ground rules. Incredible deterrence, it turns out, isn't just about having the weapons. It requires sustained political will, real resolve to actually test the boundaries when necessary.
And it seems the most important restraint, that core rule about avoiding a direct NATO-Russia clash, that's held firm, thankfully. But almost all those other initial self-imposed Western limits on specific types of weapons, those seem to have been gradually eroded or just abandoned through this whole incremental process of testing the waters and signaling. The ceiling of what's considered acceptable risk keeps getting pushed higher.
It does. And that incremental testing, that constant pushing of boundaries, it leads us to what might be the final and perhaps the most dangerous strategic challenge emerging from this war.
Which is what?
It looks like Russia's trying to establish a new playbook. Use conventional military force first to seize territory, and then immediately pivot to relying on its nuclear arsenal. The strategic ambiguity, the threats of vertical escalation, to essentially shield that captured territory, to consolidate its gains, and deter any effective counterattack. If that becomes normalized, it threatens to fundamentally change what strategic deterrence means. It risks turning deterrence from a doctrine meant to prevent aggression into one that actually enables territorial expansion under a nuclear shadow. And the potential shift, well, that's a global risk that goes way beyond just Ukraine or Europe.